Thank you, thank you. So I was only able to be here this afternoon, so I missed most of the talks, but it seems that my presentation will be a bit different, because this is not an empirical case study, and this is more like a very general theoretical reflection. It's called Architecture and the Possibility of Critical Theory, and it draws on the introduction to one of the books that was mentioned here, Architecture, Critique, Ideology, from 2016. So I think I also sent the text to some of you, so you can possibly distribute the text if you want to. So I'll just talk freely around these notes that I have here. So we heard about Manfredo Tafuri. He was mentioned earlier here today, and I think a lot of discussions about what a critical theory of architecture might be would start from Tafuri's work, although of course it would not necessarily end there. So if one looks at how Tafuri began to propose this idea of critical theory, he called it the critique of architectural ideology, which was the name of his first programmatic essay from 1969, which was, since we're discussing about planning here, it was also published in a small avant-garde Italian journal called Counterplan, Contropiano. So the idea of being somehow countering, refusing the plan was already from the outset part of Tafuri's idea. But then again, this idea of critique of architectural ideology was reworked all the time, and it became more and more opaque, more and more self-reflexive. And I think if one looks at the pretty classical, traditionally Marxist ideas in 1969, were then not reversed fully, but at least complicated to a great extent. And I think in his final theoretical statement regarding critical theory, which is the preface to the book The Sphere and the Labyrinth from 1980, which is called The Historical Project, 1980. And he says there that the self-reflexivity of critique must strike back at the kind of, as it were, methodological assurance that you find in the 1969 essay, where in 1969 the first text wanted to somehow confront architectural discourse with the material conditions of reality, to which architecture, Tafuri argues, only offers imaginary solutions. Then, Tafuri states, then in 1980, the real problem, he writes, is how to project a criticism capable of constantly putting itself into crisis by putting into crisis the real. So the idea that there would be a simply given material reality to which you could apply critical theory is then, as it were, projected back into itself. One has to question the idea of the real, and thus also project the idea of critique back on itself. One has to criticize critique and somehow dispel the assurance that at least initially was there in the idea of a critical theory. So I want to somehow reflect on this evolution in Tafuri, and what I say will be somehow a comment to Tafuri, but also drawing on many other people. So I think what gradually emerges here in this trajectory from 69 to 80 is the need to think, is to allow these three terms, architecture, critique, ideology, to somehow coexist at the same level, which renders their borders fuzzy in a way that would require a long comment here, so I'll just provide a few remarks here. So rather than a critique of architecture ideology, which obviously sets down the top-down relationship of principles and applications of subject and object, theory and practice, I think if one looks at this as a kind of lateral discourse, a kind of lateral dimension, other connections emerge between architecture critique and architecture critique and theory. So if one begins by the very term architecture, it's obviously, I think this has been stated over and over, and we heard it today in many senses, critical theory, for a critical theory to become productive, it cannot refer exclusively to material structures, buildings, bricks, mortar, and neither can it simply zoom out to discuss, as it were, let's say, environments, large-scale urban structures, but should more generally explore the idea of, as it were, spatial, even the word spatial is difficult here, signifying structures in general. That would also include text, images, and various modes of representation. As we've seen, for instance, in this NEO project, architecture today is largely about fantasies, illusions, simulations, future projections. It is about engaging a whole effective discourse. I mean, as Beatrice Colomina has shown, it was already there at Le Corbusier from the start, but today it's become so pervasive that even the very materiality of architecture is somehow fading behind this screen of discourse or projections that has increasingly become, I would say, identical to the term architecture. So architectural critique, then architecture must be extended to encompass, as it were, the whole of culture. So this fluid status then, which would join terms like presentation, representation, reality and image, materiality and immateriality, is one of the reasons I think why theory and practice cannot be opposed. For instance, in terms of the intelligible theory and the sensible practice, because I think these oppositions have to be perhaps not discarded, but at least rendered more fluid. Because there is always something sensible and material in any kind of thought. There is thought as a kind of embodiment that obviously may take on all kinds of guises, but which is never there as a simply external clothing and that would somehow veil an inner sense. And inversely, there is, I would say, but never something purely material and mute. I mean, nothing is simply there in any physical sense, in space or time, without extending out into the imaginary and into the sphere of concepts, and as well as somehow detaching itself, if ever so slightly, from the temporal present. I mean, just as all theory is already a claim about our way of inhabiting the world, prefigures a certain type of embodiment, all ways of being in the world have their horizons and their apertures towards the intelligible, if there is to be a world at all. So I mean, theory and practice are intertwined or enmeshed, as is sensible and intelligible in theory and practice. And the world is never a closed set of anything, but it exists by virtue of its gaps and porosities, and the leakages of lines of flight that it makes possible. So I think the idea of world as closed has to go, and if one takes leave of that idea, then the whole idea of theory and practice becomes very much unsure. So architecture is then not something that is somehow signified out there, but architecture as a term is a problem. And we already know that Siegfried Giedion in 1920, when was the book published, Building in France? 29, right? 29. He said that perhaps the very term architecture has to go, because we're dealing now is organizational flows and patterns. He uses the railway station as an example, whereas architecture is nowhere to be found. And Moholy Nagy already said that a couple of years earlier. Perhaps the term architecture has to be discarded because it seems to imply something materially identifiable, circumscribable, which is not what architecture is already about. And that was in 1929. So yeah, right. So architecture. The second, critique. I mean, there's an obvious relation of this term to a whole tradition going back to Kant and Hegel and Marx and Benjamin Adorno. There's a whole lineage of critical theory. But I would like to understand the term critique in a more general sense. I mean, so that it comes to include positions that would not normally be included in this dialectical philosophy inherited from German idealism, but also positions that would stand opposed to it, for instance, the work of Foucault, for instance. And I think a crucial idea that should be included in that idea of critique is what Foucault calls the ontology of actuality. That is a kind of reflection on our own present. Not in the sense that it would say that we have to judge everything from the past, from the vantage point of the present, but we need to dislocate the present from itself. There is no such thing. I mean, just as there is no thing which is simply there, out there, there is no present which is simply here in time. Because the present is always fractured, it's composed of many layers of time, and the present, to somehow dislodge the present from itself, is, I think, a crucial philosophical idea that was involved in Foucault's idea of an ontology of actuality. So I think this is probably there too in some of the best representatives of the Frankfurt School, like Adorno, for instance, that I've been working on for many years now. And I see a strong connection there. So the idea of critique is a way of splitting. It is a way of splitting both the idea of the object, and the idea of the subject, and the idea of the present, of us being somewhere located precisely in space and time. So architecture, critique, third, ideology, which is perhaps the most delicate concept. I mean, it's interesting that you rarely hear the term ideology today. I don't know why, because it's so infected by all kinds of discourse that we feel to be somehow outdated today. But a lot of contemporary uses of the term, I would say, still go back to the model proposed by Marx in his German ideology. You know, the idea of the camera obscura that gives us an inverted picture of the world, so that ideas, instead of material processes, come to be seen as determining factors. And against this inversion, I mean, Marx famously proposes that we should in fact look at the material conditions, and we should look at the material structures that actually produce ideas, and not as Hegel, which is probably his target here. Hegel would say that it's actually ideas that produce the material reality. And I think as a general theory, this formula is in many respects far too simplistic. I mean, first it simply seems to naturalize ideology. It's a natural inversion, Marx says, that occurs as naturally as the inversion of the image on the retina. The second, it makes it simple to, it makes it very simple to somehow dispel ideology, because if ideology is simply the inverted world, then we can turn it back again and we see what it looks like. But in fact, it's not so easy to see through ideology. It's just not a question of flipping the image once more. And I think it was precisely these problems, the somehow simplistic idea of ideology, that made it essential for another philosopher, which is perhaps not at all read today, Louis Althusser, a French philosopher, who proposed a new theory of ideology, which is perhaps forgotten today in some sense, but I think it's still worthwhile to consider. It's an essay called Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses from 1970. And he says that ideology should not be perceived as belonging to a subject's way of representing the world. It is not a false representation of the world, but it belongs to subjectivity as such. And I think there are lots of theoretical underpinnings for this theory that would probably make no sense today. But I will not talk about that. But rather, what I think is an interesting contribution, because for Althusser, ideology is not a flawed or inverted representation, but it is a material and bodily encoded practice that establishes normalcy. Right? It is providing precepts for actions, how we should think, how we should move, what it means to be a subject. So ideology is not a false representation of ourselves. It is a mode of representation that makes ourselves into ourselves, that actually constitutes the subject. It is not an intellectual mistake. It is what makes any kind of mistake possible in the second sense. And he cites, interestingly, a model of how ideology is actually enacted. It is Pascal. Pascal asks in one of his letters, how does one really do? If someone asks him, how should I become a Christian? How can I become a Christian? And Pascal responds, fall on your knees, move your lips, and you shall become a believer. It's the falling on the knee, the moving of the lips, the actual repetition of phrases, not basically of phrases, but of actions, of gestures, that produces a believer. So then normalcy, or Christianity in Pascal's sense, is not limited to skills and various forms of know-how, but it includes the very sense of being someone, or being a subject, with a particular identity and features, being a man, being a woman, being white, being black, being Christian, non-Christian. Ideology permeates the whole idea of being a subject. So the subject does not have an ideology. It is not the carrier of an ideology, but it is ideology through and through. And rather than originating from within, Althusser suggests the subject is constituted by an address that comes from the outside. We call it an interpellation. Someone addresses you. The God says, I have given out my son for you, or the teacher says something to you, or the police in the street, which is Althusser's example, said, hey, you there. He said, who, me? Right? And you turn around and you become the subject by being addressed by a voice or a gesture or something. And of course the historical forms of this may vary, but the sense of being constituted from outside, and the subject responds by turning around, assuming its identity, and henceforth knowing, I am that person, I am the sinner, I'm the useless person, I'm the criminal, or I'm the good person, the normal subject, whatever you are. And Althusser says that this operation in modern societies is carried out what he calls the ideological state apparatus, the church and the school being the two most visible ones. And they do not function by producing then false images of ourselves, but by organizing modes of conduct. And while they are not architectural, of course, in any specific sense, they may be taken to involve a kind of, as I call it, spatial signifying practices. And it creates the schools and the church and any other institutions that would function along the lines of ideological state apparatuses. They create divisions and closures and trajectories for the subject. They are diagrams, as Foucault would say, Michel Foucault would say, who proposes the idea of the diagram the same year as in fact Althusser's essay. Sorry, I misplaced it. It's 1975, not 1970. The same year as Althusser's essay, Foucault writes this more visible and today well-read book, Discipline and Punish, where he reads Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon Prison as a diagram, he says. And diagram, Foucault says, is an abstract machine that distributes forces and points of application, and it can be embodied or actualized in all kinds of different institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons, military facilities, whatever. So the diagram is an abstract machine that sorts and locates subjects and objects in a particular spatial structure, and then it can be incarnated in a prison, a school, manufacture, and so on. And Foucault introduces the term diagram with reference to the military camp. And he says, I have to quote him here, the diagram of a power that acts by means of general visibility. And he says then in relation to Bentham's Panopticon Prison, the diagram, this building must not be understood as a dream building. It is the diagram of a mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form. Its functioning, abstracted from any obstacle, resistance, or friction, must be represented as a pure architectural and optical system. It is, in fact, a figure of political technology that may and must be detached from any specific use. So he sees the diagram as a way of thinking about spatializing power. The diagram is the most abstract possible representation of power, which is then spatialized and then embodied further down in various institutions. And Foucault's use of the term may have been incidental. I don't think he uses it once or twice in the entire book, but then it was, of course, picked up famously by Gilles Deleuze in his 1986 monograph on Foucault, and then it was used in all kinds of senses, and I think senses that were really opposed to Foucault in the as you probably know, in the Annie magazine, they had a whole issue called Diagram Work, where diagram was used in a much, I would say, in a really different sense. But the diagram is one way of representing power relations, and they are spatialized and they're actualized as oppositions, as subjects and objects, as action, reaction, which is why Foucault says resistance is not. You don't have to explain why there is resistance, because there's action and reaction. Resistance exists at the same time as there is exertion of power. In fact, resistance comes first, Foucault says. And this has been enigmatic for many commentators. I think what it means to say is that the diagram organizes a kind of multiplicity. The diagram does not act in a void. It organizes a multiplicity that precedes it, and it orders it and structures it, but the multiplicity resists. There is resistance because there's ordering. Order is always resisted by that which is ordered. And resistance is not necessarily good, ethically good, politically sound. Resistance can take any kind of form, but there is ontological resistance because the diagram actualized in the multiplicity that precedes it. So, coming back now to Althusser for a moment, we may see this architectural connection of the ideological state apparatuses if we look at the origin of the term ideology. And I think this is, in fact, interesting. And this has been done by Antoine Picon, a French historian, in a very detailed way. So I'm drawing on Picon's work here. If one looks at the origin of the term ideology at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, in the writings of the French ideologues, as they are called. And the most famous one, Destutt de Tracy, is the one who coined the term ideology. Of course, we might say that if one translates ideology back into Greek, it would be Plato's theory of ideas. It's a logos of the idea, and already Plato's Republic is the first ideology because it's a theory of ideas, and how ideas produce subjects and organizes social behavior. So Plato's ideology or Plato's Republic is the first ideology, which is of course then also signified by the fact that Plato says one has to say a lot of noble lies to everyone to make them obey this political order. So anyway, Destitut Tracy proposes this theory of ideology, and he collects his writings in a book called Elements of Ideology, Éléments d'idéologie, in 1804, which is the same year as the architect Ledoux magnum opus, Architecture Considered in, what do you say, translated, L'architecture considérée sous le rapport de l'art, des mœurs et de la législation, Architecture Considered with respect to art, to customs, and to legislation. And as Antoine Picon points out, it is not simply a coincidence, because Ledoux was well aware of Destitut Tracy's writing, and he's not the only one, but he's the most famous one, because he somehow coined the very term ideology. And the Tracy's conception of ideology is not the one that would emerge in Marx, false consciousness, a systematic distortion of reality, but rather a sequel to earlier empiricist and sensualist epistemologies from Locke through Condillac. For de Tracy, ideology is an analysis of the genesis of our knowledge, and it coincides with the analysis of the sign. The sign, he says, the sign is what produces and organizes and makes knowledge possible. And the sign is both something arbitrary, since it always results from a singular and contingent sensation, which we translate into a sign, and something essential, since it allows us to form, discern, and hold on to ideas. I mean, the sign is what makes it possible for us to form and hold on to ideas and somehow preserve them. And I think in this context it is interesting that Tracy says that man's primordial relation to and sensing of himself, as it emerges through the encounter and use of such signs, comes from the resistance offered by the outside world. It is the resistance of the outside world that causes me to stop and form a sign and then form an idea, and there's a dialectic between the sign and the idea. And the resistance is primordial resistance to movement. So there is an inherently spatial sense in the formation of this sign. And Antoine Picon, and perhaps I'm extrapolating somewhat here, but I think it's implicit in Antoine Picon's reading of this. This is why Ledoux can understand architecture as a prefiguring of projecting. We know the word project emerges at the end of the 18th century. Architecture is a projecting of future human sensation, because the architect composes a pattern of possible movements, a possible trajectory of the body. And as we know, for Boulez and Ledoux, this means that geometrical structures, before they are reflections of some immaterial Platonic supertemporal order, first and foremost are tools that have an impact on our affectivity. The geometrical structures are meant, we know this in almost like a bit silly sense, in Ledoux's buildings, they are supposed to have a moral impact on us. And architecture is the kind of art that attaches itself and impacts on us on this very level where we form the first science, rather than discourse and ideas and concepts and religions and philosophies. Architecture impacts on this first effective level. And they give rise to a new type of sentient individual. So in order for us to become moral people, we have to be transformed on this level of first sensibility, which is where architecture has its essential capacity. This is what it projects, in the sense of projecting it into the future. And this, of course, interestingly enough, is roughly the same time we have Kant's Critique of Judgment, only like 8-9 years before, 1790. This can be understood as a kind of aesthetic turn. This is an aesthetic turn of architecture, right? But not aesthetics understood in terms of contemplation of beauty or judgment of taste in that sense, but aesthetics as the production of a new sensorium. Aesthetics, the aesthetic dimension in architecture, is what enables it to produce a new type of subject. It is interesting, one may note that at least some 10-15 years ago, when I was asked to give this talk, I think you wanted me to say something about the post-critical something. I hesitate to say anything about that term, but I don't like it at all. But if you say architecture and the possibility of critical theory, it means you're not in favor of post-critical theory, right? But when that discussion emerged, there was this whole rhetoric about the effective term, the effective with an A, not effective, but affective was one of the key terms that architecture as project. the effective project. I don't know to what extent they were aware of this historical connection, but it's very obvious that they were somehow retrieving this historical link to the late 18th century. And so the aesthetics of architecture would then have to think two things together: the sense of beauty and the sense of taste and the sense of the sexiness, the desirability, and everything we can talk about today, the seductive capacity that people talk about in this post-critical discussion, and the fact that this aesthetic thing has to do with the new sensorium, with the way that architecture impacts on us on a level that is not already shaped by ideas and ideologies in the more traditional sense of the term. So ideology, in this sense, begins its operation on a level that precedes reflexive consciousness and precedes the kind of conscious or intellectual discourses that we have. And if it works through images, which we have seen now to the fullest extent how it works through images, it is not because images are false or, as it were, inverted representations or representations of pictures or some pre-existing real that they would somehow distort or somehow make cover behind their veil or something, but it's because the images are themselves real. They are forces and powers that shape the subject and shape the subject at a level that precedes consciousness. And I mean, to that extent, there is some truth in the effective turn, but as long as one does not understand effective, okay, let's go and do that. But we have to think of this in a critical sense, in the sense to see it as something that harbors both possibilities and, of course, as it were, positive and negative possibilities. And I think Foucault's resistance to the term ideology, you know, he would famously say, I hate the word ideology, I don't want to use it, derives at least partly, I think, from the way in which it seems to presuppose an already given subject that then will represent the world in a false and distorted way. And what I understood in this way I do now, I think it would fully coincide with Foucault's idea about the subject, that is formed as a kind of action and reaction in relation to outside forces that it both taps into and controls, but is also subjected to. And there's a process of subjectification going on. The subject is never given, but always a process of subjectification. And ideology would be a term, understood in this sense, for the level at which occurs. And it's important to say, I will say this now and then I'll stop maybe 22 because I have a long paper, but it's been a long day and you're all tired and this is very abstract. So I'm going to go on for like 8-9 minutes more and I stop. So it's important to see that this shaping, this ideological machinery that works in us is not exerted on some inert matter that is simply there, so we will be simply forced to become something we are. We're not created by ideology, as Althusser seems to be saying. And this is a problem with Althusser. He seems to leave no space at all for resistance. This always struck me as curious. We had a discussion many years ago with François Matterron, who's the editor of Althusser's collected writings, and he's also been one of these people who have been looking into Althusser's manuscripts. There's a whole production called Sur la reproduction, reproduction, from which this ideology essay was extracted. And I asked him, François, isn't there any sense in which Althusser would see a possibility for the subject to respond? He said, no. So in that sense, there's something lacking in Althusser's theory. But I think, okay, we can focus on the bad things, but we can, I think we can help him here a little bit, in the sense that the subject is also resistance. It is subjection and resistance at the same time. It is something that is always split up in reaction and action, which means that the subject is constituted in such a way that it is always both less and more than itself. And if one, Althusser developed this theory by reading Lacan, which he read very carelessly, I must say. But if one looked at what Lacan says, he would say that yes, the subject is lacking, but it is lacking in a positive sense. The subject is that which is always lacking because it is never simply there, in space or in time or in your body or in your mind. The subject is that which eludes us. And Althusser says that the interpellation never misses its target. The cop says, hey, you there, and I say, who, me? Given this other reading, you might say that the interpellation always to some extent misses its target or splits its target, so that the subject is constituted as this kind of split. The the subject as a structural self-representation spans a constitutive gap, precisely because the address, in fact, never hits its object, but opens a trajectory of identifications that inscribes the circles in ever-widening circles. And I think for if one looks at Foucault's reading of the Panopticon, for instance, and he would say, some people have said that, but Foucault thinks that the Panopticon works. He's very naive. He thinks that these systems and schools and prisons and factories, that they actually work. Foucault, no, of course they don't work. They work by not working, because they work precisely by integrating modes of resistance and by producing modes of resistance that they then might integrate, so they feed off resistance. They actually thrive on resistance, which always threatens to destroy them. But they can only exist by producing more and more of that which threatens to destroy them, and then attempting to extract the surplus value from it. So in that sense, the prison always works by not working. And as Foucault says famously around the same time, the law is not there in order to prevent people from doing something. It is there in order to produce illegalities. It is there in order to produce a cut, a division, so we can distinguish various forms of illegalities and create ever more complex system of how to represent actions. The same way the prison is there to, as he would say, the invention of sexuality was there in order to produce perversions, because the law of the signifier, of the phallic signifier, enables us to now invent more and more perversions, which we know was the case during the 19th century. Krafft-Ebing invented thousands of new perversions that no one had ever heard of, because the law of the phallic signifier made a cut in reality that made it possible to invent all these fluctuating swarms of perversions around the phallic signifier. So in that sense, this diagram functions precisely by creating resistance and by also being able to extract, and that's the ambivalence of it, extracting more energy from resistance. You might describe this in a more classical Marxist, 70s Marxist sense, recuperation, you have resistance, and then resistance becomes itself a fashion, and all these things, we know them. And I think Foucault produces a more, as it were, metaphysical or ontological account of this by saying that this is how power works. I mean, you can always resist power, but there is always the chance that this resistance will be exactly what power feeds off. And this is what Foucault, a bit later, calls liberalism. Interesting, we spoke about neoliberalism, but he has, these lectures, The Birth of Biopolitics, where he speaks about liberalism and says that liberalism is not veil, it is not an ideology, he says. It is not something that distorts reality, but it is a way of working with reality, to allow a certain latitude, a certain freedom in the subjects. This is now the state apparatus of the late 18th century, in order to extract the surplus value from them. So in that sense, neoliberalism is precisely that which is able to feed on our desires, and also producing desires that it then may feed on, and also producing resistance, which is also able to extract a surplus value from. So in that sense, neoliberalism is perhaps the most insidious and difficult thing to discern, because it's not simply an enemy out there, and a lot of discourse about neoliberalism, I think, projects this as the other of us who are the good leftist intellectual peoples. But if it were that simple, it would simply go away. It is also inside us in a very particular sense, because this is the kind of subjects that we have become. And I think Foucault shows this in his analysis of neoliberalism. And so I don't know if this is helpful in any sense, or if this just confuses the terms. But I wanted to say that critical theory, I think, has to account for all these things. I mean, of course, you can have a critical theory that says architecture represents power, it is capitalism, it is neoliberalism, etc., etc. But we must also be able to acknowledge, not just factually, but also in theory, that this thing that we are trying to oppose and that we so dearly want to oppose is also almost constitutive for the kind of subjects we are, right? So, and how to account for this would be a problem about the reflexivity of theory, the reflexivity of critique. Can critique criticize itself? Is there a limit to critique? Is there some point where we are unsure about the, as it were, the methodological protocols that we are using when we're doing critical theory? And I have no answer to this, but I think it's an urgent question. I think it could be addressed both practically, but also on a very abstract theoretical level, which I just did, and I hope it made at least some sense to you. So thank you.